Hey everyone, hope you guys are doing well. This is FPL Fran, and we're back with another video, which is going to be another what we have learned video. And to start off with, I actually thought it would be best for me to explain the sort of fixture landscape that we have right now. As right now, I am watching Everton and Crystal Palace playing the FA Cup, and that will have some impacts on what I will be talking about today. But the first thing I would like to talk about, of course, is now that we're effectively in the second half of the season, we are anticipating double game weeks and blank game weeks, and they're going to be rescheduled within at least the next 8 weeks, or at least at that sort of last quarter of the season, where we can think about, of course, further wildcard strategies, free hit strategies, and things like that too. Right now, I think it's not necessarily worth actually setting in stone a free hit strategy or a wildcard strategy, because a lot of these sort of postponements that we have in place still haven't been rescheduled, and we will have additional information on the double game weeks as well, based on the outcome of specific cup fixtures. And the most important cup fixture is going to be Liverpool versus Arsenal in the FA Cup, and I'll pretty much show exactly why that is later with a very, very good Ben Krellin tweet later. But right now, in terms of double game weeks, what we have, of course, are two games that have been right now postponed, already confirmed, right? Bournemouth and Luton. This happened because, of course, the unfortunate incident that happened to Luton Town's captain, Tom Lockyer, who, of course, is fortunately fine now. We'll see what happens to him eventually in terms of returning back to professional play. But as far as another double game week, we have also Man City versus Brentford. Now, this was, of course, supposed to be played when Man City went to the Club World Cup. Instead, of course, they actually went and won the Club World Cup, and that's going to have an impact. The biggest thing here now is that we have probabilities based on, amazing fixture planners that we have, and I already name dropped one of them in Ben Krellin. I would say, of course, within Bournemouth and Luton, the expectation is that that game can be really scheduled anywhere between game weeks 23 to 28, 32, or beyond, right? Much later into the season. That's possible, but it makes sense because these teams aren't necessarily involved in major cup fixtures during these periods, that the fixture can be rescheduled during those weeks and sort of create a double game week as well. As far as Man City versus Brentford, unfortunately, of course, due to City sort of being involved in so many different competitions, only 25 and 28 are possibilities, and 25 seems to be the most likely scenario according to, once again, Ben Krellin. As far as Liverpool versus Luton Town, this is not necessarily a blank game week game that has been set in stone yet, but it's more so a fixture that we actually believe will become a blank game week in 26. So if you look towards the right hand side of the graphic that I've sort of created, as you can see on blank game week 26, we're actually expecting for 3 games to potentially lead to blank game weeks, right? Liverpool versus Luton, 80%, Chelsea versus Tottenham, 90%, Man United versus Fulham, 20%. So the indication, of course, is that Man United versus Fulham game, it could actually very likely just become a regular fixture in game week 26. However, for the Liverpool versus Luton game and the Chelsea versus Tottenham game, it's very likely that those two games are going to be rescheduled. And the only thing that I would mention about the Liverpool versus Luton game is that there's a high chance that it will be postponed and rescheduled actually earlier ahead of schedule in game week 25 instead, which would create, of course, a double game week for Liverpool. Now, the significance of this is such that, when you look at the Chelsea and Tottenham game, there are going to be games where we have some blank game weeks in the future that are only going to be postponed in that sort of last quarter of the season. So right now, as we stand in game week 21, there is no real need to necessarily prepare, for example, to get triple Chelsea or triple Tottenham, just because they're going to have a double game week much, much later in the season. That game will be postponed and replayed much later on, and there's no need to plan for that now. So that's why I'm only illustrating potential double game weeks that would show up within the next, for example, 8 game weeks, right? Or at least next 12 game weeks. Any further beyond that, I think, is a little bit too ridiculous. We're talking about potential double game weeks in 37, which, of course, we don't necessarily need to plan for right now. So that's the idea. And, of course, when we talk about double game week 37, that's just something that we can simply plan with when we wildcard later in the second half of the season. I have made a wildcard video on game week 21, but, of course, that's only really necessary for managers who have extremely horrible teams, blighted by injuries, a lot of suspensions, etc., so on and so forth. I do think we're going to be planning to save our wild cards ultimately, as you can see here, for that sort of last quadrant of the season, which would mean at least, 28 and beyond, in my opinion. or at least on 28, if let's say a lot of double game weeks seem to fall on there, and we can plan around it. So those are my initial thoughts in terms of sort of understanding the fixture scheduling, the postponements. The biggest thing here with Man City and Brentford is, of course, we want to be invested into Man City and Brentford players, and the same with, let's say, Bournemouth versus Luton in the case of Bournemouth, right? So a lot of people right now have been going for example, Neto as their second goalkeeper, which makes a lot of sense if you're expecting the double to happen within the next 8 to 10 game weeks. If you're looking at, for example, City versus Brentford, it does make sense to slowly move towards the triple up of City. A lot of people have already invested into Foden, and of course, if you're someone who's transferred out Haaland, I'm sure you're probably going to be thinking about transferring back into Haaland, particularly, of course, if this double game week is going to happen. And that's crucial because, of course, around game week 25, we know players like Son and Salah will be back in the game. But if you have a preference, for example, to, let's say, build around teams for the double game week instead for game weeks 25 and 28, you can do so around that time instead, as opposed to making transfers now. So, for example, if let's say Foden, who of course is someone who we expect to lose a bit of minutes due to KDB coming back, Doku coming back, Haaland coming back, you can see, of course, what happens with the City team up until game week 25, then make that decision on Foden. And the same thing you can do, of course, with players like Ederson or Walker if you have any faith in that City defense. Now, as far as Liverpool versus Luton, this is an interesting situation because, of course, you know, the best case scenario is that Liverpool do have a double game week in 25. But of course, there's going to be a blank game week in 26. So it actually does call into question whether or not we prepare, for example, a potential free hit, right? Because if let's say you're prepared to go without Salah until, let's say, game week 30, if you're prepared to, for example, not own any Liverpool assets, then it actually makes sense to potentially just simply free hit on 25 if, let's say, the City and the Liverpool double game weeks both coincide on game week 25. And then in that situation, you can actually maybe go with a team that's pretty light on City and pretty light on Liverpool as well, and maybe benefit, right, from other fixtures that other teams would enjoy. So that's just, for example, an early thought into the fixtures. And just to top that all off, we have, of course, another extremely well written, concise post by Ben Crellin. You can follow him on social media platform X or Twitter, or formerly Twitter rather. Effectively, what he says here, of course, is that Liverpool versus Arsenal is the most important fixture in terms of cup matches, right? And how that can influence potential double game weeks and blank game weeks. But it effectively is just what I've already explained. I think the biggest thing here is just the suggestion that, of course, this Liverpool versus Arsenal fixture is the most important tie, as I said, and that it can have huge impacts because Liverpool could also have a future blank game week as well when they play Everton later on, right? So there's a potential blank game week in 29 for Liverpool, which of course would have, you know, additional impacts on, let's say, how we plan around Liverpool. Because if, let's say, Liverpool do blank in game week 29, as I said, then free hitting on 25 to get Liverpool players makes sense. And then you can actually, for example, continue to own a team that doesn't really have Liverpool players. And so that could be quite interesting. And the last thing, you know, we'd like to end the video off with, and the last segment really, is to sort of do, you know, a rehash of what we always do in the What We Have Learned series, but it's just effectively updating our understanding of all the teams within the Premier League and just briefly discussing, you know, where they've moved really from the last video, which is game week 13, and just discussing what I think about these teams, where they've moved in this sort of chart here, and what we can expect going forward. The biggest thing and the biggest movers, I would say right now, just looking at, for example, how we have now some more teams within the worst attack, better defense quadrant, and some more teams in the better attack, worst defense quadrant as well. So, for example, the top left quadrant and the bottom right quadrant. So that's going to be, for me, look, Bournemouth, who've actually definitely improved as a team, Tottenham, who have, for example, radically changed as a team, but not necessarily improved, right? The biggest thing with Tottenham as of late is that they've actually improved as an attack in terms of underlying stats, but actually continue to regress as a very bad defense. And this is no surprise because we have been seeing, for example, Romero and Ben Davies play as center backs, and it's not very pretty when it comes to defensive football. So you see results like the Brighton game, and it's really not a surprise. In fact, I'm just sat there thinking about Erling Haaland when he played Tottenham game week 13 and how we only got away with so little on a Haaland captaincy there. But the biggest thing really is that this Tottenham team haven't actually necessarily shown to be a poor team. It's just the case that, particularly with those key defensive injuries and their style of play, more importantly, that of course it makes sense that they are one of the teams that are comfortably in this sort of better attack, worse defense quadrant. The biggest sort of drop off in terms of any team within the Premier League has definitely been to Newcastle. Now, of course, you can argue that there was also a one-off result between Liverpool and Newcastle, where Newcastle, of course, conceded 7.5 expected goals. But the biggest thing and the biggest trend, I would say, from this Newcastle team is that they're falling from a position where they were effectively the third best defense in the Premier League and now literally dropping out of the top 10. And that's such a dramatic shift, even if you sort of exclude that Liverpool game. So it already shows that there's been a worrying trend for Newcastle, and it's not surprising because they've had a lot of injuries. They have been involved in a lot of cup competitions, and they clearly, unfortunately, have not been able to sort of withstand, I think, the demands of that sort of really tough schedule. And so Newcastle have definitely dropped off as a defense. We're also seeing, for example, some changes in terms of injuries within the defense. And then also, for example, I suppose the surprise, dropping of Trippier as well on the Liverpool match. So quite a few impacts there. Plus, of course, the Pope injury. Ultimately, I think that just shows that we should have less confidence in Newcastle as a defense, but actually they're still very comfortably one of the better attacks in the Premier League. So I wouldn't be too worried, for example, owning someone like Gordon past Gameweek 23, or for example, if you have someone who is so crucial, for example, to the attacking point of view of Newcastle, if Trippier, for example, reasserts his position in the team, as the starting player, then it would make sense, of course, to continue owning Trippier if you do so. As far as teams that remain, for example, in that top right quadrant, so for example, elite teams, no surprise really to see, for example, Chelsea and Liverpool still up there. We're seeing players like Palmer, Salah, Jota, for example, Darwin. These are all very good attacking players, and they still play a huge part in very, very good attacks. And I think the biggest thing, of course, between, let's say, Chelsea and Liverpool is just making sure that you understand that there has been some change, some shifts in terms of, let's say, of course, playing time expectations, right? Salah leaving to AFCON means that Harvey Elliott will probably move into a right wing position, but you also have to now accommodate for Jota when there are effectively three players who either play left wing / center forward within that team. Luis Diaz primarily more so a left winger, whereas Gakpo, of course, and Nunez more so left wing / center forward type players. And so that's quite interesting right now. With Chelsea too, I think we're starting to see, for example, someone like Sterling get dropped. We're seeing Jackson also playing out wide at times, but Nkunku is also back in the team. Madueke has been playing brilliantly, but he's basically been a right winger, right? And so the biggest thing here is that to accommodate for their best player in their best position, Cole Palmer really effectively as the 10 is the most interesting sort of appealing asset in FPL. If anything, I think in a period where you don't have Salah and Son, I think he becomes effectively an essential asset. As far as going back to a team like Spurs, for example, you're looking at Richarlison as someone to own definitely when Maddison is out, but Maddison also seems to be very, very close to coming back on Gameweek 22. So that's interesting. In terms of, for example, teams like Brighton, Brentford, Aston Villa, and Everton, they're of course on the sort of lower left-hand side corner of this sort of top quadrant here. But really, these teams have actually been there all season long, and so no surprise that some of them have moved a little bit. For example, Brentford, I think, have definitely pulled back as an attacking team, but still, for example, comfortably quite a good defense. The biggest thing I would say with Brentford, though, is actually that Flecken is the worst goalkeeper in the league when you factor in, for example, playing time, and you, for example, let's say, only look at keepers who have started basically every game of the season, right? So I would exclude, for example, Jason Steele. I would exclude, for example, Verbruggen as well from Brighton. Once you exclude those two players in terms of keepers who have actually played predominantly throughout the entire season, Flecken is the absolute worst shot stopper in the season. And so that's quite a big glaring sign. I think we have reason to believe that Brentford are a good defense, and they have shown to be a very good defense in the last two seasons. But Flecken's shot stopping, I think, is definitely worth asking questions over. And potentially, of course, it makes sense to, let's say, drop players like Pinnock as well, unfortunately, right? If you've, let's say, owned Pinnock for some of the good fixtures where they've completely, for example, wasted opportunities to keep clean sheets. And unfortunately, of course, the Wolves game was a sort of glaring example of how many mistakes this Brentford defense can create at times. As far as Everton, I think they've played incredibly well, even with the point deduction. They haven't really showed any signs of stopping, bar, of course, that sort of one-off Wolves game. They've also had injuries, and this is an interesting time in general for the entire Premier League, where you can say, with a lot of players coming back from injury, I think we can continue to sort of look at this sort of chart here, be a bit more holistic about teams, and think that, of course, if they all come back to full strength, that this is effectively the sort of picture that we've built this season, and that we can expect, for example, for teams like, let's say, an Everton or a Newcastle, who have been decimated, I would say, by injuries quite a bit, that they would continue to stay there. As far as teams like Arsenal and Man City, I think the biggest thing and the biggest change between, let's say, Arsenal and City is that both of them, of course, are the top 2 defenses in the league, and that's very, very clear. But the biggest thing is now that you have a team like Liverpool where they're predominantly much better at attacking, but also, for example, top 3 defense. So Liverpool for me is that sort of standout team where they have a lot of assets that we definitely want to pick apart now that Salah's gone. Whereas with City and Arsenal, the biggest thing I think, going back to City, sorry, is that KDB and Haaland and Doku are back, right? So that should really strengthen up City's attack. Meanwhile, their defense really should not lose out too much. They've actually missed out, for example, a couple of Rodri games this season. So, knowing that Rodri should be fit and is available ultimately now, and Stones is probably close to coming back, I would think the City team would continue to trend, for example, in a positive direction from an attacking point of view. And someone like Haaland, for example, would continue to, for example, do much better, considering that he's actually going to be able to play football. As far as Arsenal, though, they have, for the most part, let's say with exception to Partey, have had their sort of starting team, available to them outside of maybe you could argue Tomiyasu as well being injured. But outside of that, ultimately with their starting team, they have still remained as a little bit of an ineffectual attack, in comparison to the lofty expectations that we have. For example, City usually are, a top 1 or top 2 offense, and Arsenal last season were a top 2 offense too. So in the context that, for example, they're behind Chelsea, behind Newcastle, and behind Liverpool, and rather closer to Spurs and even Aston Villa, it just suggests that, of course, there has been a bit of a drop-off from those teams from the attacking point of view. But with City, we have some positives, for example, particularly with players coming back, that would lead us to maybe have loftier expectations of their attack. Whereas with Arsenal, I think there is some just genuine question marks, right? But it goes back down to, for example, I think Arsenal still ultimately are a very, very good team and are still, for example, a top 5 offense or top 6 offense. Keep in mind, of course, that the expected goal stat also includes penalties, and some of these teams have had more penalties than others. And so once you sort of exclude penalties, Arsenal, for example, are actually a little bit worse for wear, unfortunately. As far as teams in the worst attack, better defense quadrant, so that top left quadrant there, as I said, a team that has stood out, for example, recently is Bournemouth, and it's no surprise. I think the biggest thing to say is that if you guys remember some of the sort of what we have learned series and some of the previous episodes, is that Bournemouth were so much closer to teams like Burnley, Luton, and Sheffield United at one point in the season that it's actually quite miraculous that they are where they are, where they're basically almost separating from teams like Nottingham Forest, from teams like Crystal Palace, and teams like United, Wolves, and West Ham. And in fact, they're almost moving and converging to potentially, let's say, that Everton sort of landing spot within the table. If we, for example, continue to see the sort of same level of performance that they have sort of put out within the last 8 games. And so that's very interesting for Bournemouth. I think it just strengthens the sort of resolve of someone like Solanke, or even, for example, investing in one of the defenders in Neto, considering that they're also one of the sort of better defensive teams here. With Crystal Palace, when you have Olise out, it just goes back to they're not exactly the most interesting attack, which is also why we probably don't own their forwards, particularly since they're not penalty takers. Whereas with Eze, if Olise is out, of course, you have full guarantees that he's a penalty taker. He should be on a lot more set pieces, and so he's probably the one pick from that Crystal Palace team that I'd be interested in. With Nottingham Forest, you have players like Alanga and even Morgan Gibbs-White who are interesting, but beyond that, I don't think there's any interest really in this Nottingham Forest team. With a team like Wolves, for example, though, they've also continued to sort of perform well for where they are. And I think it goes back to, for example, when you're looking at teams like Fulham, Wolves, and West Ham, can you pick apart one player who is a standout player? And I think with Wolves, of course, the biggest one here is going to be Hwang, who is actually on penalties, but unfortunately is out in the Asian Cup. And so even though Neto's going to come back, I think when Hwang's back in the picture, you're still looking at the highest goal threat of the team in Hwang. You're looking at the penalty taker as well. And because he actually is sort of so talismanic in that point of view, right? You expect him to have higher goal share. He is interesting, even though Wolves aren't a top team. The same goes for someone like Bowen, who particularly has done well on expected goals per 90, but also is one of the leading overperformers of the season. That actually is the same camp where Hwang sits, Kudus sits, where Son sits, of course, which I think is fair for Son because he's always been an overperformer practically throughout his entire career, and also Bowen. So those are effectively your sort of top 4 overperformers of the season, and it still makes sense to, for example, in my opinion, invest into those players because despite the overperformance, ultimately their underlying stats are very, very good. With Bowen, I think the only sort of drawback, once again, similar to Watkins, is that he doesn't have penalties. With Fulham, I think it's a bit tougher because you have a couple of players who, for example, do benefit from penalties or free kicks at times, such as someone like Willian, but his minutes are not guaranteed and his fitness is also not guaranteeing anything. Same with Andreas too. Whereas, of course, the bottom 3 teams in the league, I don't really think we need to talk too much about them. Of course, there is Lyle Foster from Burnley, but really you're still looking at majorly, maybe let's say even Doughty from Luton. I think the only interesting thing from Doughty too is that you expect some of these blank game weeks from Luton to be, rescheduled, and there's going to be some double game weeks. So actually, if you own someone like Doughty as a defender, the biggest thing is that you'll be owning, let's say, Doughty on the weeks where you, let's say, don't have him as your fourth or fifth player on the bench. On those double game weeks, you'd be basically one player ahead of the rest of the field, right? And he's actually such a great attacking asset right now. He's probably the only interesting attacking asset or true asset really from any of these three teams that I would generally think about investing in. And that's more so if we have comfort that actually some of these fixtures are actually going to be rescheduled in the short term as opposed to later on the season for Luton Town. So those are my thoughts right now in terms of the overall picture of what we have learned in terms of FPL. I hope this helps in terms of sort of understanding and navigating the landscape right now. Of course, we've talked about some of the blank game weeks and double game week probabilities. We've talked about how we sort of see teams and some certain players that we can actually pick out from these teams. But as usual, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. If you do like the content, do feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Otherwise, have a lovely game week, and I'll see you guys in the next video.